In a world where housing costs have pushed working families out of city after city, one European capital keeps showing up as the exception. Rents in Vienna sit at roughly half the level of comparable Western European capitals. A city of nearly 2 million people, an economic and cultural hub, and yet a nurse, a teacher, or a transit worker can still afford to live close to the center. That is the promise. And unlike most urban promises, this one has not quietly collapsed under the weight of growth and time. But here is the contradiction that makes Vienna worth examining. The model that keeps housing affordable was not designed by a modern think tank or a progressive city council elected last decade. It was built in the aftermath of catastrophe, under conditions that no city today would choose to replicate. And it has survived nearly a century of political pressure, economic crisis, and ideological opposition. The question is not just why it works. The question is what it actually took to make it work, and whether the lesson is transferable or simply a product of a very specific moment in history. To understand Vienna's housing system, you have to go back to the early 1920s. The city had just emerged from the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was overcrowded, disease-ridden, and facing a housing shortage of staggering proportions. The working class lived in conditions that reformers of the era described as incompatible with human dignity. Tuberculosis rates were among the highest in Europe. Families of 5 and 6 shared single rooms in buildings with no running water. The social democratic government that took control of Vienna in 1919 made a decision that would define the city for the next 100 years. They would not rely on the private market to solve the housing crisis. They would build. And they would fund that construction through a direct tax on wealth and property, redistributing resources from the city's wealthiest residents to its most overcrowded. Between 1923 and 1934, Vienna constructed more than 60,000 publicly owned apartments. These were not the bare minimum tenements of other cities. They were designed with courtyards, libraries, kindergartens, and medical clinics built into the complexes themselves. The most famous of these, the Karl-Marx-Hof, stretches for more than a kilometer along a single street and still houses residents today. This is the origin point, but origin points do not explain persistence. Many cities built public housing in the 20th century. Most of those programs eventually deteriorated, were defunded, or became associated with concentrated poverty and neglect. Chicago, London, Paris, and dozens of other cities built at scale and then watched their social housing systems hollow out. Vienna did not follow that path, and the reason why is not simply political will. It is structural. The critical mechanism is this. Vienna's social housing was never means-tested in the way that public housing in most other countries was designed. In the United States and the United Kingdom, public housing became housing of last resort. Eligibility was restricted to the very poorest residents. That design choice had a predictable consequence. It concentrated poverty, removed the political constituency of middle-income earners who might have defended the system, and created the conditions for stigma and disinvestment. When only the most economically vulnerable live in public housing, the political will to maintain and fund it erodes. Vienna took a different path. Eligibility for municipal housing, known locally as Gemeindebau, was set at income thresholds that included a broad cross-section of the working and middle class. A household earning a comfortable salary could qualify. That meant teachers, civil servants, and skilled tradespeople lived alongside lower-income residents. The political constituency for the system remained wide. When budget discussions came around, the people defending social housing were not only the city's poorest residents, they were voters across the income spectrum. There is a second structural feature that matters just as much. Once a tenant secures a municipal apartment in Vienna, the rent is set well below market rate and remains stable. Tenants do not face the kind of rent increases that private markets generate during periods of high demand. This stability has a compounding effect. Residents build lives in their apartments. They do not move frequently. The social fabric of neighborhoods remains more intact than in cities where displacement is a constant pressure. And because residents stay, they have an incentive to maintain and invest in their buildings and communities. The turning point that tested this system most severely came in the 1980s and 1990s, when Vienna, like most European cities, faced pressure to privatize public assets and reduce the role of government in housing markets. The ideological tide across the Western world was running strongly against public ownership. London sold off its council housing stock under right-to-buy policies. Other cities followed. Vienna resisted, but not without cost. The pace of new construction slowed. The waiting list for municipal apartments grew, and a new instrument emerged to fill the gap: limited profit housing associations, which operate under a legal framework that caps their returns and requires them to reinvest surpluses into new construction and maintenance. Today, roughly 60% of Vienna's residents live in either municipal housing or housing provided by these limited profit associations. That scale is the key to the system's effect on the broader market. When the majority of the housing stock is insulated from speculative pricing, the private market cannot simply set rents at whatever level demand will bear. The existence of a large, stable, affordable alternative acts as a ceiling on what private landlords can charge, because tenants always have a credible option. It would be dishonest to present this without acknowledging the genuine uncertainties and criticisms. The waiting list for a municipal apartment in Vienna can stretch to several years. The system has faced criticism for being slow to respond to rapid population growth, and Vienna's population has grown significantly in recent decades. There are also questions about whether the model is accessible to newer residents, including migrants and refugees, who may face additional barriers to qualifying for social housing. These are not trivial concerns. A system that works well for established residents but struggles to absorb newcomers is not a complete solution to urban housing pressure. There is also the question of fiscal sustainability. Vienna's housing system was built on a foundation of municipal ownership accumulated over decades. Replicating it from scratch would require a city to acquire or build an enormous amount of housing stock at today's land and construction prices, which are vastly higher in real terms than they were in the 1920s. The political conditions that made the original construction possible, a city government with strong tax authority, a clear mandate, and a population in acute crisis, are not easily reproduced. What Vienna's model actually demonstrates is not a simple blueprint. It demonstrates a principle that the design of who is eligible for subsidized housing determines whether that housing retains political support over time. Systems that restrict access to the very poorest tend to lose their defenders. Systems that serve a broad cross-section of the population tend to survive. That principle is transferable even when the specific institutional history is not. The other lesson is about scale relative to the total housing market. A small social housing sector cannot stabilize rents across a city. It can only house the people lucky enough to get in. A sector large enough to represent a genuine alternative for a majority of residents changes the dynamics of the entire market. Getting to that scale requires sustained political commitment across generations, not just a single ambitious building program. Vienna did not avoid the pressures that have broken housing systems elsewhere. It faced them, and it made a series of structural choices about eligibility, about ownership, about reinvestment that allowed the system to accumulate rather than erode. The city is not a utopia. Its waiting lists are real. Its challenges with rapid demographic change are real. But the core promise that a working person can afford to live in the city where they work has held in a way that it has not held in London, San Francisco, Sydney, or most of the other cities that once made the same promise. The adjacent question worth sitting with is this: at what point does a city's housing market become too distorted by speculative investment to be corrected by incremental policy? Vienna's system works in part because it was never fully dismantled. Cities that allowed their public housing stock to shrink to a marginal fraction of the total market may face a different and harder problem. Not how to maintain a system, but how to rebuild one from near zero in a political and economic environment far less favorable than the one that made Vienna's century-long experiment possible. Visual reconstructions are illustrative. Facts and interpretations are based on the sources listed in the description.